RI Unit Podcast, Episode 6.
Developing world headed for another debt crisis.
For Jayati, Ghosh and Howard Nicholas.
This was really part of it where Howard and I have also been noticing this increasingly apparent hypocrisy, perhaps because maybe it's always been there. But now it's becoming more and more ridiculous where the advanced countries are basically adopting a lot of policies they used to argue very strongly against, say that would be the worst thing ever. And they go ahead and do it. And then when it comes to developing countries, the narrative is still no, but it's okay if the advanced countries do it, but developing countries shouldn't do it. But yeah, let's get into a bit more detail as we go along, because there are quite a few aspects to those types of policies. Basically, Jayati, as you have also frequently discussed in the past, there and what we wanted to tackle today is the debt problem in the developing countries that has not gone away, right? We saw quite a major fracture appearing in 2021 and 2022, with many developing countries experiencing debt crises. Case in point, Sri Lanka. And of course, as you have also pointed out, the thing to focus on there has been the external debt, because it's all been about the foreign currency denominated debt. Developing countries simply run out of the foreign currency and can't repay the foreign currency they've borrowed. And here, I thought one interesting thing you have actually mentioned in the past is how the problem was created in the first place, which had a lot to do with the loose monetary policy that was adopted in the advanced countries, perhaps somewhere like 15 years ago. Can you perhaps elaborate a bit on that, how that, to your mind, caused the accumulation of external debt in the developing countries and eventually became a problem?
Yeah, I think the latest phase of the debt crisis that we're seeing, because we have seen periodically these waves of debt crisis, right, in the developing world, and in Latin America, it's really now more than 150 years that they've experienced cycles like this, where you get capital inflow for a while, and then for some reason it breaks, and you have a major financial and debt crisis, and so on. But what we've seen really in the last 20 years is something slightly different. We saw one wave of debt crises in the 1990s, which was mainly due to the fact that more and more countries had got integrated with global capital markets. And so then you had what was called this phenomenon of emerging markets, the middle income countries that were seen as viable propositions for private capital to flow. And it created more indebtedness, both sovereign debt and private debt, in a number of countries. And this happens over the 1980s for sure. And then by the 1990s, you get a series of these debt crises. And the World Bank, I think, estimated something like 72 debt crises in developing countries. Now, this meant that developing countries, we all know what happens when you have a debt crisis. You have a major problem in external payments. You can't meet your interest payments. That leads to possible default or at least great difficulty. So you have to go back with a begging bowl to the IMF. The IMF makes you do a lot of adjustment measures that push your economy further down the tube. And so you suffer a lot. And so through the 1990s, a series of these debt crises. What we got in the 1990s was a series of debt crises that made developing countries realize just how expensive it is to face that kind of problem. And you would have thought that that series of crises would teach developing countries that it's not really necessarily in their interest to get so involved in global capital markets, that you have to be careful about the kind of external debt you take on, because you always have to be ready to repay it, even when things go bad and your interest rates rise dramatically for some reason beyond your control. Unfortunately, that's not the lesson they were learned, and that's not what they were told by the IMF, the World Bank, and everybody else who's supposed to be managing all these things. Instead, they were told, no, you should actually be more integrated with the global capital markets because you need all that foreign savings for your investment. That's how you're going to grow. And so what the major part of developing countries did is something very strange. They actually started building self-insurance. They started saying, well, okay, we have to keep enough reserves to manage it in case we get a run on our currency, in case we get a capital outflow, we'll be able to deal with it by keeping a lot of foreign exchange reserves. And what do you do if you keep foreign exchange reserves? Your central bank has to hold a lot of foreign exchange, and you do that either by running a current account surplus and adding to the foreign exchange reserves, or even borrowing and then adding to the foreign exchange reserves. India does that, for example. We borrow and add to our foreign exchange reserves. It's ridiculous.
Which hardly seems sustainable.
Exactly. And the point is also this, that where do you put your foreign exchange reserves? You have to put them in the safest possible place. And that turns out to be US Treasury bills. So throughout the 2000s, you find developing countries are desperately buying US Treasury bills. Asian central banks at one point were buying more than half of the treasury bills in the market by the mid-2000s, yes. And every developing region was exporting capital to the US. We were funding that enormous housing boom that then came crashing down with the subprime crisis. But here's the thing about the fact that there are all these currency hierarchies, the dollar on top and then the euro and yen and so on, and down to the bottom to all of us, down to all of our currencies, is that once you're in that currency hierarchy, any shock means that capital flows out from your country. And that shock doesn't have to come from your own country. It can come from some other country. And that's really what happens with the global financial crisis, right? The US is the epicenter of the crisis. And yet when that crisis happens, capital flows out of all of our countries to the US. Flight to safety. US is always safety. Right. And so we got the worst out of that. And again, you would think that this would actually teach us not to have these very open capital accounts where you are not necessarily gaining from the fact that you are able to access foreign funding because it can flow in and out so quickly, but also because you're paying very high rates of interest on the money you borrow. And the money you send out, you're getting very low rates of interest. So, you lose out even the successful countries, the Thailands, the Malaysias, all the countries that are seen as very successful. They have very high seigniorage costs like this. They get a low rate of interest on the assets abroad, and they pay a high rate of interest to foreigners for the assets that they hold in their own country. In Thailand's case, that comes to 5% of GDP over 20 years. Imagine every year they're losing 5% of GDP. It's crazy, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, I think you've also said that it's also been a two-sided problem, right? On the one side, you have these developing countries going for this type of debt, which has not been smart. As you said, you would think they learned their lesson, especially after the crises we saw in the 80s. And I had a look at the data as well, like you see from 1987 to about 2001, external debt stocks are pretty, for developing countries, are pretty stagnant. But then after 2001, you also see when the advanced countries adopted or started adopting this ultra loose monetary policy with super low interest rates, there was a desire from, let's say, commercial banks, insurance funds, hedge funds in the advanced countries to find assets that would give them more, right? They needed higher returns. And you can see that the commercial debt really exploded since then. So here that international sovereign bonds actually rose from about 350 billion in 2001 to 1.2 trillion in 2022. I mean, that's an insane rise. And I think here you've made the argument that it's been two-sided, this thing, right? It was pushed by a lot of entities in the advanced countries, and then it was accepted by many of these developing countries. And looking forward, I was wondering now when we see a possible reversal of this ultra loose monetary policy in the advanced countries, for instance, the 3-month treasury bill rate in the US is at the highest it's been in 17 years. And there's been some talk by the Fed, right, that they want to reverse their ultra loose monetary policy. What do you think, Jayati, the implications are going to be now for the developing countries? Is this going to be better or worse for them going forward?
It's really interesting because exactly what you describe, it became so marked after the global financial crisis, right? Because the only way that these advanced economies recover is through an incredibly loose monetary policy. I mean, trillions and trillions released into the US market every month. And every single major economy central bank was behaving in that same extraordinary fashion. Massive amounts of liquidity release, mainly going to the banks, very, very low interest rates. In Japan's case, negative interest rates, just pushing the money out there. And so you have all these banks and wealth funds and, managers of money sitting on this enormous cash pile and looking for places. You have all this money sloshing around the globe looking for an outlet. So you have not just emerging markets, suddenly you have this new term, frontier markets. And which are these? These are all the low-income countries which were simply not considered before. And suddenly they have all these investors saying, yes, please, here's all this money and it's very low interest rates and we're willing to invest. We'll start some issuing sovereign bonds. We'll buy them. Private companies, please come to us for loans. We'll give you the loans. It was crazy. And this was actively encouraged by the IMF, which is supposed to actually be warning countries against this. It was certainly encouraged by the whole Davos crowd. And I think, Sri Lanka is a really interesting example of how this played out. Because if you remember, most of Sri Lanka's debt earlier, before that, was really bilateral, multilateral. It was not really private loans in the same way. Sri Lanka opens up the bond market, I think it was 2009, right? I mean, Howard will know better. But it grows a little bit in 2012, but it really explodes from 2014 onwards. And they're using the sovereign bonds, they're issuing sovereign bonds, getting the foreign exchange to repay the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, how stupid is that?
Yeah, I mean, Howard has actually spoken about this quite a few times because it's the confusion has been, right, that it was all the crisis was all caused by the most recent Rajapaksa government, which came in 2020. Meanwhile, as you said, nobody, and I mean nobody, ever mentions the fact that most of these ISBs were taken on by the government prior to that and by the central bank staff prior to that. Howard, do you have more to say about that? Because I think you also...
Actually, I wanted to say something, but by asking Jayati a question, following what you said in a recent debate on television, Brahm, and that is, so we have now this debt problem, and the fear is that to resolve it, we will have austerity, but also more borrowing. Now, in a presentation that Brahm was making recently, there was a 4-person panel and they were discussing it. He quoted you, and he quoted one example which has gone under the radar, and that is the case of Germany in the immediate post-World War II situation, where the way in which Germany was helped to come out of their debt problem is totally different from what is being proposed for developing countries today. And I wanted you to repeat what you said about that, because when Bram said it, I think one of the panelists, who is actually quite an influential person, asked Bram to give him the exact evidence for that. Wasn't it, Bram? I can't remember what he said to you, but he was very.
And I said Jayati said it. So if there's anything wrong with it,
actually, I think a lot of people would be very interested to hear that, because I think it's an important way for many developing countries to move forward. And instead of passively accepting the sort of debt restructuring which the IMF and the World Bank and the US and Western countries are proposing, we can cite what happened with Germany, which actually really got to the source of the problem. And the source of the problem is countries do not have the foreign exchange earning capacity to pay their debt. So how did the other countries help Germany to develop that earning capacity in order to be repaid for the loans they made to Germany? And you brought that out, and so many times we have mentioned that to people, and they said, "Well, we've never heard this before."
This is so important, and there's a reason why you don't hear it. It is actually suppressed because it's a bit too.
Absolutely.
It would give too many people the wrong ideas, if you like, about how debts can be properly dealt with. And in fact, when you think about it, this thing that happened, the London Debt Agreement of 1953, okay, this was done by the major creditors of Germany, who included all the rich countries, but a whole bunch of other less rich countries as well. There were a lot of these other bilateral loans and things that were given at the time, including, by the way, Greece, which did not get the same treatment from Germany when recently Greece faced its own crisis. So remember, this is the context of the Cold War. And the West really wants West Germany to succeed relative to East Germany. So they are the ones actively trying to make sure that this deal works. And it was an extraordinarily generous deal by current terms, but it was a very sensible deal. So half of the debt was actually just written off, converted into grants, fully half of it. The rest of it was converted into long-term loans with a proviso that the interest payments would not exceed 3 to 5% of the export revenues. Can you imagine that? The export revenues. You would not have to pay interest beyond 3 to 5% of your export revenue. Now, what that does is, of course, dramatically limit the actual debt servicing, but it also gives all your creditors an incentive to make sure you earn more exports.
Exactly.
And so they are opening up their markets and encouraging you to export more and do all of those things. And that is really, to me, one of the critical necessary conditions for the German post-war miracle. Everybody talks about how they had this massive industrialization drive and this and that. They don't talk about the enabling conditions. This was an absolutely crucial enabling condition. And it's based on the completely sensible idea that the best way to solve a debt problem is to grow out of it. And growing can happen only if you're not crippled by the massive need for repayments that would not allow you to invest domestically. Now, why did they do it? Was it suddenly that they became all good Samaritans and they decided to love the Germans and so on? No. They had realized that you don't do this, and that's what they hadn't done. Remember, in the previous period, in the interwar period, they had demanded reparations from Germany. They had forced Germany to pay. They had created a complete economic crisis within the country, and then they got Hitler. And that memory was fresh in their mind. So they said, okay, to avoid Hitler, we have to allow this country to grow out of its debt problem. Unfortunately, that message is lost. Yeah.
I think that's the main difference, right? This frustrates me to no end here is, first of all, the perception that there is, that the international community sort of has the best interests of Sri Lanka at heart. But second, the complete, it's been completely ignored that there is a difference between external and domestic debt. So all you will hear here is, we have to manage general debt levels, and they come with percentages of GDP, and, we start talking exact numbers and projections and all of that. But the whole discussion of foreign exchange earnings, which is the main issue because that's what you defaulted on. Sri Lanka ran out of dollars. It's not that they couldn't pay debt back in general. It was the dollar problem. And that's exactly what the example of Germany shows, is they knew exactly what the problem was. It wasn't general debt levels, because all the concessions given were related to dollar earnings. I mean, I read another one after I was quoting you. I actually went back to several of these articles mentioning it. And there was another clause in there as well where they said Germany actually didn't have to make any debt payments if they didn't have a trade surplus in that year. I mean, it's... and nobody is talking about the trade deficit that Sri Lanka has had for the last 40 years. I mean, it's so crazy.
What I think is important, Jayati, is that that message is now repeated, because what has happened is the narrative is coming from the West and coming from the IMF and the World Bank. And basically, the alternative is lots of well-meaning people from the developing countries are saying, well, we have to safeguard welfare and safeguard this and that and the other. So do not make the budget cuts so swinging. So actually what has happened is that the terms of the discussion has been framed by the advanced countries, and the alternative perspective that actually comes from real historical experiences has actually been mothballed. And this, I find, is really strange. And it's something that I think should be raised as a very serious alternative, as one that actually should be at the forefront of the demands of developing countries. And, that's why that Germany example was, for many people in Sri Lanka, an absolute eye-opener. Because, I had vaguely heard of it, but I didn't fully understand the significance until I went over what you had said. And I thought, well, wait a minute. There's also a parallel here with what happened after the Second World War with the East Asian countries. And there I've repeated many times, countries like the US and also Europe, they know how developing countries actually develop. They know that they have to help them to industrialize. They know they have to open their markets to them. They know they have to give them lots and lots of concessions, because that's what Korea got, that's what Taiwan got, that's what Singapore got. And so now when we come to the modern world and resolution of debt problems, we actually know, and this is what we have said many times in many fora, that if you look at a whole number of developing countries, I think, Brahm, you have the chart of how many? 168 developing countries. And you separate out the non-industrializing ones from the industrializing ones. The non-industrializing ones all have continuous current account deficits, all of them, underscored by continuous trade deficits. And we're talking about a period of 40 years. This is the period that you've taken, isn't it, Brahm, in that chart?
That's right.
All the industrializing countries have had surpluses. Now, when you have recurrent deficits like that, sooner or later, you're going to run out of foreign exchange reserves. You're going to borrow up to a certain point, but eventually the pack of cards crumbles. And then you have the debt crisis. So, when we say that Sri Lanka has gone back to the IMF 17 times, what does it mean? Are we so stupid that we can't manage our finances? Or is there something common to us to, let's say, all the sub-Saharan African countries, all the Latin American countries that also have been repeat offenders. And of course, the answer given by the West is, oh, you have corrupt leaders. Well, that may be. But there's one underlying feature, and that is that we're not industrializing. And that, in one way or the other, has actually been blocked. Whereas in the case of Germany, and in the case of these East Asian countries, the industrialization was promoted and they made sure it was export driven. In other words, they opened up their markets to them. So Germany resolves its debt problem like that. And the East Asians, they actually get this huge impetus for growth by doing something that we're all told should not be done, with this amazing state-led industrialization process based on exports, with the advanced countries opening their markets to these countries. Now, in a way, this is a recipe for most of the developing countries if they want to have a sustainable exit from their debt problems. I don't see any other way, And,
well, that's one
the
part, probably. But Jayati, I think you've also mentioned this frequently, is another part of developing countries dealing with this issue. Is what several have been trying to do, is move away from the dollar, right? But President-elect Donald Trump seems to want to make that really difficult for developing countries. I mean, he's now explicitly threatening anyone that wants to shift away from the dollar, especially targeting the BRICS countries. I was wondering, what are your thoughts there? Like, is it going to be very difficult now for developing countries to attempt to shift away from the dollar?
This is such an interesting question, and there's so many moving forces at work at the same time, right? But I mean, to begin with, let's admit that Donald Trump's approach to the dollar is very contradictory. On the one hand, he wants a weak dollar, that is to say, in terms of the relative price. He doesn't want the dollar to appreciate compared to other currencies because he wants to push US exports. That's part of his making America great again, right? Less imports, more exports. So he wants a weak dollar, but on the other hand, he wants the dollar to be the dominant reserve currency. You can't have it both ways. If it's going to be the dominant reserve currency, it is going to be the flight to safety. And you can't decide the value of the dollar. The rest of the world will. They will buy dollars when they want safety, so-called, right? And so he can't really have it both ways. And I'm very curious to see how this is going to play out. If he thinks that he really wants to keep a low dollar, then the only solution for him, for the US economy, is to put in some capital controls to prevent all that money rushing in and raising the value of the dollar. Who knows? Maybe he will even do that. I mean, let's face it, he's blown up all the other neoliberal kinds of orthodoxies like, free trade, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll see about that. But, this whole thing about BRICS countries moving to another currency, it's very premature. I don't think it's on the cards in the foreseeable future. That is to say, certainly the next decade or so. The shift away from the dollar has already happened. And it's going to keep happening, and not because of Trump, because of Biden. Because Biden, first of all, he continues all of Trump's trade policies. He really didn't change a single thing. In fact, he got even more aggressive towards China in terms of technology and all of that. But then he does things like, you sanction Venezuela, you sanction Iran, you sanction Cuba, you sanction all these countries. But then not only do you sanction Russia, but you also say we're freezing all of your dollar accounts in the US. Because we've decided we don't like you anymore. Now, you do that to a very large country like Russia. What message are you sending to central banks everywhere else? You're saying, well, listen, if we decide we don't like you, we're just going to freeze your assets. We don't care about international law. We don't care about our own laws about the right to property, etc. if we decide we don't like you. And so,
I'm so happy that you also said that it's not just Trump. It actually seems like this is now a bipartisan approach, right? I mean, it
Yes.
doesn't matter who is in, because it has great implications, right? If you do believe that it's just all the result of madman Trump coming in, then in 4 years' time, we'll be fine again. But that's the question now, isn't it? Is this all going to be over in 4 years, or are things actually going to keep escalating until the fundamental problem is dealt with? Like, where is all of this coming from? Why is the US increasingly hostile and abandoning all the principles it used to adhere to? Right? Like you said, free market, a champion of free markets, it used to be.
Well, if you look at the long run, if you take a longer view of history, you will observe that it's always the economies in decline that are against free markets, free trade, etc., etc. And it's always the rising ones that are pushing for it. So when does Ricardo start pushing, against the Corn Laws and in favor of free trade and so on, is when England is now in a greater competitive position vis-a-vis the rest of Europe. Okay? When does the US start demanding free trade? Because the US is highly protected as it industrialized. It actually put in lots of tariffs and different kinds of trade controls until it got industrially strong. And then it's all for free trade. So the rising country, once it's risen, is all for free trade. Who's the country most in favor of free trade today? China.
Mm.
And the US is actively saying, no, we want protection. We want to control our own industries. We don't want to give you technology. We don't want to, etc. So I think this is a reflection of the waning economic power of the US, which they took a little while to recognize themselves, but it's been happening for a while. It's not going to get over tomorrow. I mean, think how long it took for Britain to stop being the dominant economy. It ran current account deficits for 35 years before people even began to recognize that it was not the dominant economy.
Mm.
And so, in a sense, the US reaction, and as you say, the bipartisan kind of approach, is almost typical of an economy in decline.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree, because this was part of the historical analysis I was doing, right? It's if you do have that approach that industrialization is important for a country, then we can't ignore what the US did during its most critical time. But of course, that starting point is one where, again, the different approaches come in, right? If you take a strictly neoclassical approach, then industrialization is not relevant at all. And that period where the US had, what was it, like an average tariff rate of 35 or 40% immediately after the Second World War. And before it as well. I mean, then you can't see the importance of that for where it is now. You know what I mean? And so those things are, again, completely ignored by even most economists here, where they're saying, well, Sri Lanka doesn't need to industrialize. It's not relevant. We'll just open up and do all those things.
The tourism and the services and all of that. Yes.
Yeah, we're completely back to that again. I mean, Howard, you've heard it one too many times before.
No, actually, before we go down that road more on the tariffs, I just wanted to take up one thing with regard to the dollar. And I'm not sure whether this has really come on the radar screens as much as it should have done, but it is the issue of $2 billion of debt by China, dollar-denominated debt by China in Saudi Arabia, which was actually picked up in 48 hours.
Oh, really?
Now,
I didn't know that.
That is a very, very important. So they issued, I think it's 10-year debt, but I might be mistaken, but just 0.25% above the US rate.
So is it now, Chinese government debt, or?
This is the Chinese are guaranteeing repayment and servicing in dollars. I mean, they're holding $3.5 trillion of reserves.
But it's the government that's
It's the government.
okay.
And now the important thing is exactly what you said, Jayati. Supposing I am now having dollar reserves and I'm buying dollar debt from the US Fed or the US Treasury, then they can do what they've done to Russia. But if I'm buying it from China, then it's a very different story altogether. Now, I don't know whether this sent shockwaves through the US Treasury and the Fed, but it should have done, because it's fundamentally a game changer. See, they don't need to have the RMB as an alternative to the dollar, because the real problem was the sequestration of assets.
Yes.
But now, if those assets are being issued by China, it's a very different thing. And from what I understand, the Saudis actually bought a lot of that, which again undermines the recycling of petrodollar earnings. Remember, before they had to go through Wall Street, but now they're not going through Wall Street.
So are they also bypassing the SWIFT system by doing this?
Completely.
No,
There is a huge bypassing of the SWIFT system.
For me, that's a different issue, Jayati. But this one is about those assets. You know, how do you hold your assets? Because obviously, still, if dollar is the main currency, we need to have dollar-denominated assets. So the question then is there an alternative to buying it directly from the US Treasury, where at a certain point they can be confiscated, you know, because it's simply a piece of paper saying that you own such and such. But if I say, well, you no longer own that, then that's struck off. But if the Chinese are issuing their own debt, except it's dollar denominated, then that changes all the rules. Now, I've only seen that one woman, Lena Petrova. She discussed it, and the other, there was just one other discussion, but it hasn't really got the attention which I think it should get, because there's a very interesting element here. Let's say you have Sri Lanka now. We have all this problem with the debt. Now China comes along and does a deal with Sri Lanka and issues dollar debt, gives us the dollars, and now we owe China that debt. You see what I mean?
Yeah, fascinating.
Well, and it also it comes.
I mean, it's really something. Sorry.
No, it comes back to what you said at the very beginning, Jayati, is that the developing countries were obligated to purchase US treasuries with their foreign exchange reserves. And that also put them in a further stranglehold, right? Whereas this would now be a way to also avoid that trap, as it were. The only one left, I think, is the stranglehold they have through the SWIFT system. I mean, for that you would, if I'm not mistaken, need to bypass the dollar altogether.
You know, I think the SWIFT system is actually significantly under threat, because BRICS is actively engaged, and this they are doing. They've started the discussions for a BRICS clear system, which is an alternative to SWIFT. And already China has got its own. Russia was using that. I think the Chinese, I forget the name of the Chinese system, but China has got its own system, which Russia had been using. And basically, I think once you realize that this can be weaponized to that degree, that overnight you can be told you cannot use this entire system of exchange on which all your payments are operating, trade, finance, everything, that more and more countries now are focusing their minds on whether we have a backup plan. And I think that one is actually pretty much underway, which is not the same as having your own currency. but it is definitely a shift away from the ability of the Western states or G7 or whatever to weaponize exchange transactions. But Howard, I'm fascinated by what you just said. This whole thing about China issuing the debt in Saudi Arabia, and you're right, it's a game changer. It might be a small amount now, but it raises this potential. But China still holds a huge amount of US Treasury bills, unless we're getting rid of them so quietly that I don't know anymore. But how would we place that? Shouldn't they be moving out of those if they can?
Yeah, let me come to that in a second. Just to go back to the SWIFT thing. Now, this is my understanding, Jayati, correct me if I'm wrong, is they have something called SIPs, but that rests on a SWIFT basis, whereas the Russian have actually introduced a completely different clearing system. And I forget the name that they've, it begins with S, I know that, but I forget the details of it. But the problem is that it's not as widespread as the Chinese SIP system. Now, what the Chinese are apparently trying to do is to shift it to the sort of Russian system over time. They won't immediately abandon SWIFT, but it's a progression. Now, going back to your question again, Jayati, I lost track because
this whole debt issuance in Saudi Arabia in dollars and so on, that's fascinating. But remember, yes, China holds a lot of reserves, but still a very large chunk of that is in US treasuries or in US securities generally.
Yes, I don't think they're going to rush and get rid of all of that, but they're definitely reducing it. We know their gold stocks, for example, are rising very, very sharply. And I would guess that they're going to now try and find other assets that they can hold instead of dollar-denominated assets. So if I'm the Chinese, I wouldn't also rush immediately to do much about that, because still you want to hold dollars and dollar-denominated assets because, it's still the world currency. And I agree with you totally. I don't think there's a BRICS alternative currency coming anywhere near the horizon in the next 10 years. I think it'll be beyond that. And it also suits their purposes, because any country that actually becomes the printer of world money has to run trade deficits. Otherwise, they can't get enough money into the global economy. But I do also think that a lot of what is being done is not very transparent and shouldn't be either.
In their own interests.
Absolutely. But I do see lots of movements. So the alternate currency, the alternate clearing system. But this dollar denomination of debt by a country that holds huge reserves, this has a lot of consequences and significance. For me, this is like a feeler. What they did with the 2 billion is a feeler.
Yeah.
And if they somehow rupture the recycling of dollars back to the US, remember that has been the base of the whole system.
Yes.
Up to now, then it's not simply escape valve for a lot of developing countries, but actually you're undermining the essence of the global financial system, which has been this petrodollar. And I don't know what phase 2 is going to be in that regard, but if any country wants to hedge its bets against being excluded by the whims of the US administration, then surely this issue of debt by China, dollar-denominated debt, is a perfect alternative. It's not much to pay 0.25% for having that security. I mean, that's the insurance you're paying. So I'm fascinated. Sorry, I was interrupting the discussion on tariffs.
No, because I think it's, I don't think they're unrelated. I think the tariff war would be, we don't even know how much he's going to follow through with all of these rather extreme threats, right? 100% tariff, 50% tariff, and so on. But that too will make more and more countries recognize a reality they should have seen all along, which is that the US is not the so-called leader of the free world. It is a large economy basically trying to out there further its own interests. And so you have to protect yourself when those interests are against yours. So I don't know, I'm thinking that there will be more and more related kinds of moves. I didn't know about the $2 billion debt of China and Saudi Arabia, but it's one more of these things, if you like, that you're throwing out there in the hope that some of them actually generate a different kind of momentum.
Yeah.
I think the issue going forward is really, describing it as an empire in decline, the US. How desperate is it going to get, right? Because while I would agree that Trump doesn't always follow through with his promises, like with his first term, was promises he was going to end all wars, he was going to clear out the Wall Street swamp, audit the Federal Reserve, all of these things, and none of it came to pass. But of course, what he did do is start the whole trend of tariffs and the whole anti-China and anyone related to China narrative, which was then taken forward. And now I'm just wondering, headed into 2025, whether, how can developing countries navigate this struggle that is going on, right? How desperate will the US get to protect what it has, protect the dollar, or in a way, try and also solve this trade deficit that has been growing in the US as well. I mean, clearly, this is one of the things Trump wants to tackle. So what can developing countries really do? I mean, would signing up to BRICS, for instance, be a smart move or a not so smart move in the short run?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question. But, let's recognize that the fundamental feature of the next few years is going to be uncertainty. And by the way, and that's also Trump's way of doing things. I mean, in game theoretic terms, the best thing you can do is always keep your opponent guessing. And he's very good at that. He's very good at being, as you say, contradictory, crazy. People say crazy, but maybe it's not entirely crazy. Maybe it's a part of a broader strategy that means that nobody really knows. Will you follow through? Will you do the opposite? Will you suddenly decide that and we know that he did all of those things, right? That but within a broader trajectory. I'm going to, I've been thinking of this recently in the last few months, especially. Trump is actually like Maggie Thatcher. I was in England when Maggie Thatcher came to power. And, I think finally what Thatcher did is change the terms of the discourse so utterly. And mind you, everybody I knew was bitterly opposed and unhappy. And, and it was very aggressively a certain kind of neoliberal and rather ruthless economy that she was propagating, but she got it. She actually did manage to change the terms of the discourse fundamentally. And I have a feeling Trump is going to do that. He's going to change the terms of he already did it in his first term, which was much less significant in a way. He managed to do it so that Biden fundamentally continued all his external policies. He didn't change any of them in any meaningful way. Okay, he entered the Paris Agreement once again, but pretty much the US did exactly what it was going to do, whether it had entered the agreement or not. It didn't. So, and, the whole thing about, greening and so on was also very much part of the technology war, was recognizing that China is way ahead in green technologies, which will be the technologies of the future. So you better get on that track as well. So I think given that uncertainty, developing countries have got to be prepared for a very different world from what certainly the people who, the technocrats who supposedly run our economic policies have got used to. It's going to be a very different world. Is it necessarily a much worse world? I'm not so sure. Because again, looking back in history, these periods of flux when there is no clear leader, where so many things are up for grabs, where the rules of the game are not so clear and not so rigidly enforced, they may be bad from a global perspective, but they're not always bad if you really want to change a global division of labor. Because, the periods when everything is very fixed, they are the periods when you really have to be on the side of the leader if you want to get ahead. That's when the US will encourage Germany to grow or South Korea to grow, as you mentioned, Howard, and all of those things, right? The periods of flux are when other countries, when the rules are not there. So if you can seize the moment, you can actually go in for autonomous industrialization. You don't have all of the multitude of barriers now posed by the WTO and by the nature of global finance and so on. You can actually try and do things differently, maybe through regional agreements. Maybe if you don't have the domestic economies of scale, maybe getting in with a group of countries. If you're large enough domestically, doing stuff on your own. I mean, I think there are more possibilities now than there were, let's say, in the heyday of the globalization in the 2000s, for example.
This actually makes me really sad. And I'll tell you why.
Hey.
Because I'll tell you why. Because that means because I would actually agree that the conditions there are more possibilities for developing countries to industrialize. So why do you see that countries like Sri Lanka refuse to go down that industrialization path? Is because of internal forces.
Yes.
The ideological war is still being won by the West. And so they don't need to even, or perhaps, this was part of the plan all along, but it's been so well constructed that Sri Lanka's own economists, their own policymakers, no matter what happens, the one thing they'll never do is attempt to industrialize Sri Lanka, even though this is now what the US and Europe, to a certain extent, are explicitly doing. And, we even have this statistic, maybe you've seen it before, Jayati, where it was a paper written by Roderick not that long ago.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he was showing that in the last, what was it, since 2010, they've counted instances of industrial policies, basically going from an annual of 34. I don't know exactly how they counted it globally, going to, in 2022, to 1,500. So from 34 to 1,500, that's an insane rise. And the most crazy thing about it is 90% of that rise is accounted for by the advanced countries implementing industrial policy. And that's why I said it makes me so sad, is the message is so clear, first of all, that all these theories of the past have been abandoned. Like you said, it's now this shift that it used to be very much neoliberalism, free market ideology. Now that has been abandoned, but the developing countries have not woken up to it yet, or, something is keeping them from having their eyes open to this, and they don't want to move down that path and actually emulate what the advanced countries are currently doing. And that's why it makes me sad and also frustrated, because it's not even a theoretical discussion anymore. It's like, just open your eyes, have a look at what's happening in the rest of the world. Why are we still talking this narrative of, they're putting up tariffs, but we have to liberalize all our trade. That's going to be best for Sri Lanka.
Yeah, you're right. And I feel the same in India. It's the same. But one is obviously the colonization of the mind that you're talking about, right? And it's pervasive in so many countries. And there is an active and constant creation of an epistemic community, which is pushing this to all developing country leaders, in different ways. But it's more than just the colonization of the mind. I think it's also something a little bit more sinister. I think it is that the interests of the elites in our countries no longer represent the interests of the people. And that they are actually much more bound in with this broadly imperialist neo-colonial system because they are beneficiaries of it. The people may not be. The country as a whole and the country's future may not be. But the elites are beneficiaries. And I don't think we should kid ourselves. I think it's as true of Sri Lanka as it is of India. They are deeply integrated, but for them it works. For them, they are actually direct beneficiaries of this. And so they add to this whole idea that you cannot do things any other way. Let me be honest, I still have great hopes for the new government in Sri Lanka. I'm really hoping that they are able to fulfill their mandate, live up to what they have promised. But I can already see the dead hand of the technocrats in the government pushing down on their, on the kinds of changes that they want to bring about in the economy.
Jayati, sorry, it was not your job to be negative about the new leftist government. That was Howard's job.
Howard, go ahead. I don't want to be negative. I really want them to do well. But
no, but actually, Jayati, if you could just expand, I don't know if you have particular reasons why you have this view. To me, it's really interesting because apart from Howard, I've heard here and there some people express doubts now about whether this really is a change in policy and strategy for Sri Lanka. But what makes you say that?
No, I'm not qualified in terms. I'm sure that a lot of domestic policies will be different. I certainly hope so. I'm really only just looking at the fact that they accepted this debt deal, which I really think they could have held out for longer and got better terms and conditions, because it is an absolutely dreadful deal. And it's dreadful not only for Sri Lanka, but it's dreadful for the rest of the world, because there are all kinds of terrible clauses in there. The bondholders are allowed to shift jurisdiction when it suits them. If, for example, legislation is passed in New York, where I believe most of Sri Lanka's bonds are actually registered, they can decide to shift to, Dakota or Delaware or Singapore or some other more friendly location where they will not be subject to any of the debt reduction clauses if that legislation is passed in New York. So they could have held out. They could have said, no, we've just got this massive mandate. We need to look at this once again. We need to move away from a macro-linked bond, which means that any improvement in our economy, you will get the benefits rather than we. And if there's a downswing, we bear all the losses, not you. We need to not have a debt sustainability analysis that is completely off the creek in terms of any rationality. We know that DSA is rubbish and it's not going to play out, and it's already not playing out in terms of the economic indicators. So they could have, I believe, taken a stronger position. Of course, I don't know the details. And of course, I don't know, whether they felt that they immediately had to do it so as to get some basic confidence and so on. I just think it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think this is what you're referring to. The classic counter argument given was that they had to do it as quickly as possible because that was good to give investors the confidence in Sri Lanka again to now bring more money into Sri Lanka.
And I can bet you anything, it was all those bureaucrats in the finance ministry and elsewhere who were telling this all the time.
They were certainly echoing what Sri Lanka's most prominent economists were saying. But this, again, back to that same old classic view, which has been proven wrong so many times. You wonder if they're looking at any data at all anymore.
Yeah.
But Howard, what do you have to say about it? I think it's a bit of a deja vu for you. You've said, right? Where well, perhaps you can best describe what I mean by that.
Well, we did have a leftist president once before in the 1990s. That was Chandrika Bandaranaike. Actually, Kumaranatunga was her married name. And when she came to power, just before coming to power, she was basically going to renegotiate the IMF deal. She was going to do this, that, and the other. But once she came in, then basically everything changed. She accepted, well, essentially she accepted a whole neoliberal agenda with privatizations and contractions in budget. But the one thing I was told was they were promised support for welfare policies. And I'm getting the impression that the same thing has happened this time around. That provided they don't rock the apple cart, they will get considerable support for the welfare policies and the welfare promises that they have made. And I'm reading this as a major strategy of the advanced countries, that as long as you, let's say, accept the global division of labor, you don't try and get out of it with industrialization and so on and so forth, we will look favorably on you. We will support you. And I get a feeling that there's an element of that which has been promised to the present government, because what we have is the US ambassador to Sri Lanka is absolutely euphoric about the NPP taking power. Now, when was the last time? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the government has just signed an agreement with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for all sorts of technical cooperation.
And extending their stay in the parliamentary building.
Exactly. In the presidential building. In the presidential building, bro.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's part and parcel of what I believe is a mafia world that we're now into. Look, if you behave badly, we're going to come after you. We're going to use the various forces, and, you know, in many cases, there are all these sleepers, as it were, and we will create problems for you. But if you play ball with us, then we won't do anything, as it were. So there is this element, and one has to put oneself a little bit in their shoes. What are you going to do? Because, you know, there was this lawsuit threatened by the Canadian investment group against Sri Lanka if Sri Lanka did not continue with the agreement reached with the ISP holders.
This was the Hamilton Bank.
That's the Hamilton Bank, yeah. And we know what happened with Argentina. So in the end, Argentina had to pay this colossal penalty. And they lost. Because in the end, as you said, you know, one way or the other, they're going to get their way. But it could be said to Sri Lanka, look, we will keep these dogs under control if you play ball with us. And I think the same with the IMF deal. Okay, if you come openly and criticize this, and let's say we do not provide you with the third tranche, that's not the end of the story. Because, you know, Sri Lanka's credit rating could be again reduced quite a few notches.
Yeah.
So, you know, one also has to recognize that there are all these global forces at play here. And if I were the Sri Lankan government, I wouldn't take on battles at this stage. I would, I think it's one thing when you're out of government, but it's another thing when you're in government.
No, this is so illuminating, and it's reminding me of, in a sense, Lula in Lula one, shall we say? I mean, really,
Exactly.
that's what they did. They did a pact with the devil. In Brazil's case, is finance, right?
Yeah.
And they said, okay, fine, we'll allow you to keep your 35% rate of interest and all the open capital account and but just allow me to do some social policy.
Yeah. And I think this is where this government is. And of course, it's really difficult to find a way out, because I think, I don't know whether the Sri Lankan government is aware of it, but one way or the other, we're facing a global recession.
Yes, absolutely.
And the second thing is, we're also facing what we used to describe as stagflation. Because it's not a recession with a collapse in prices, but it's rather a recession with high prices. Because the tariff policies of the advanced countries are going to feed into that, and the supply chain disruptions are going to feed into that, without any doubt at all. So we could get the worst of all worlds, in which case, again, Sri Lanka will be looking for support, because one of the things that will come under pressure is the budget. I think there's no doubt about that. And again, we're likely to have pressure on our forex reserves, because that's what happens to all developing countries in global recessions. I mean, it's the developing countries that get hit the hardest by far. So if they have an inkling that this is what they're looking at in 2025, and maybe it's been pointed out to them that this is a likely possibility, then they don't want to take unnecessary risks. And, I think this is going to be a real problem for them. My bigger concern is this, that assuming we're going to be going into a recessionary phase, once we come out of the recessionary phase, we're going to have interest rates rising, but not from very low levels, but actually from quite high levels historically. I mean, when I talk about historically, I mean talking of the last 10 to 15 years, where they've been exceptionally low. I don't think they're going to go to those low levels. And I think once the world economy recovers to some extent, and I'm looking at 26, 27, then it coincides with a period when Sri Lanka is going to have to start repaying its debt, and will have problems with its reserves, because they'll just be emerging from this global recession, which means to say they're probably going to have to borrow to meet some of the debt amortization and servicing obligations. And that is what I'm really worried about, is then they're going to be actually borrowing at even higher interest rates to service existing debt, where it's already, as you've said before, at penalty rates. I mean, these are really crushing rates that Sri Lanka is faced with. But I'm now worried that they're going to have to borrow yet more to service, and they'll be borrowing at a time when interest rates will be higher, definitely higher than they are at the moment, and rising quite possibly quite rapidly, depending on the inflationary impetus that the tariffs and other policies of the advanced countries give rise to. So that's my concern for the government. And
There's
if they...
There's an interesting parallel there, though, isn't it? I mean, I know they're different situations, but the same discussions are there in Sri Lanka and the US. You wouldn't think, but it is the case that the discussions are both about the budget deficit. Because I believe in the US, there's an increasingly large part of the academic community as well as policymakers voicing concern over continuous high budget deficits. That also, I mean, it matters what you spend on, right? I think I've seen you say this, Jayati, where when you're spending on things like infrastructure, which clearly need to be revamped in the US, then that is something that can contribute to economic growth. But when it's a lot of other things, and what Trump is now planning is tax cuts, and that is going to continue these budget deficits, then that may eventually become a problem, like it is in I wouldn't say like it is in Sri Lanka, but the discussions are there, right? And one thing there is the interest component for both these countries is growing if we're looking at the percentage of expenditure. But I was wondering whether you could weigh in on that. Like, what are the discussions currently in the US? Is there real concern about, let's say, government debt level and continuous budget deficits?
Well, the US government's debt is always a bit of a joke because they have this absolute limit, and so Congress has to periodically say, well, okay, you can actually raise that limit. So it's not even in relation to GDP or anything. It's an absolute limit that they have to constantly negotiate. And the funny thing is that the Republicans are the ones who go on about it the most, so that it's Republican administrations who find it much easier to raise the limit. Because whenever they're in power, all the Senate and Congress and everybody agrees to raise the limit. And when the Democrats are in power, they make it absolute nightmarish to raise the limit by demanding various tax cuts and other things to compensate for that limit, or, cuts in social security spending or something or the other. In other words, a political agenda is advanced through that. So yes, there's a lot of talk about the budget deficit. And certainly if the US were a normal country, I think last year it would have been 6.5% of GDP. This current year, that's a lot, right? We would have gone through a crisis if we had that kind of deficit. But the US is not that country, right? The US issues the world's global reserve currency. The US doesn't have the repayment problem. And of course, they spent massively in the pandemic. They brought it down a little bit in the subsequent year, but it still remained. And then, subsequently with all of the other measures, it's remained very high. And many of the subsidies involved in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, turned out to be much larger than they were slated to be. So I think one of the incentives for the green thing, which was expected to be around 360 billion, turned out to be in excess of $1.5 trillion or something. So definitely the budget deficit is rising, and I suspect it will rise more because Trump has walked in saying that yes, he's going to slash taxes, but he'll make it all up in tariffs. And he's also going to slash spending because he's putting those two crazies in charge of destroying the federal government as is known. Now,
the Doge ministry.
Yes, that's right. The Doge ministry with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Yeah. Yes. So the discussions are a bit weird because there's a whole bunch of Keynesians and others who point out that, the deficit, it's really the excess of expenditure over income that matters rather than the federal budget deficit overall, and the level of the debt. And then there are all the right-wing economists, as Howard has been saying, this stranglehold of monetarism still on people's brains, that still argue that no, you have to immediately do something about the deficit. I suspect that when it comes to the actual workings of the government, they don't really bother with the deficit. They have to go through all of this charade in Congress and all of that, but they don't actually bother with the deficit. Most of these spending decisions and tax decisions are deeply political. That is, they're all about distribution. They're not really about the macroeconomics of it.
I mean, again, this is yet another one, right? How wasn't that long ago, right? That the consensus was that any budget deficit was supposed to be bad, like we were saying with the industrial policy. I mean, what happened there?
Yeah. Just wanted to add one thing before I come to that is I think what is being lost in a lot of these discussions is what really is the basis for competitiveness. You know, the assumption being made, not just in the US, but also by Europe. And remember, we've been through this 50 years, 60 years ago, that if you just raise tariffs and give subsidies, you improve the competitiveness of companies. Actually, that's a complete misunderstanding. What you have in the US is monopolies. And they're just actually boosting the profits of monopolies. But there's not an environment which really encourages competitiveness and technology change on the basis of that competitiveness. Whereas, by contrast, what you see in China is exactly that environment. You know, so we've repeated this many times. How many EV car companies are there in China? How many major EV car companies? Well, EV car companies, the last I counted was 160 odd. The major ones, you're talking about 30 to 40, you know, and they're in a do or die battle and constantly innovating. So I'm following a lot of these auto sites that traditionally only focused on German cars and sometimes occasionally Japanese cars and Korean cars. More recently, they focused on Japanese and Korean as well as German. But today, I would say 90% of their presentations are all about Chinese cars and the technological advances these cars are making, which leaves in the dust the cars that are being produced in the rest of the world. And now, if you go to drones, it's the same thing. If you go to batteries, it's the same thing. And what China has done is it's created, you know, the traditional old-fashioned capitalist competitive environment. Not only in terms of encouraging competition, but they've also created the base which the US created for its own industries. In other words, a very low cost base. Good roads, railways, energy prices, etc. But now they don't have that anymore. So no matter what they do with tariffs and subsidies, they're never going to be as competitive as the East Asians. Never, because their infrastructure is at least 60 or 70 years behind these countries, and it's not easy to change that around. I remember actually when Hillary Clinton was contesting Obama, one of the things that Clinton actually said then, she said, if we are going to actually make the US more competitive, we need to invest something like $20 trillion in roads and railway maintenance. You know, and it struck me that it was a non-starter. Because what people in Congress wanted was more money for the weapons manufacturers, more money for basically pork barrel politics, etc., etc. But they weren't thinking long term, which is exactly the opposite with China. You know, they've been thinking long term, and actually now they're almost out of sight. So the only refuge that they have in the US and in Europe is tariffs. I mean, this was bound to happen, as it has happened. You mentioned this, it happened so many times in the past, Jayati, that we should have predicted this. This was going to happen. But I don't think they realize it's not going to change anything. It's not going to change the dynamism of the US economy. It's not going to change the dynamism of the European economies, because there's no way they're going to make their own economies more competitive with the sorts of policies that they're thinking of implementing. You're muted, Bron.
Sorry, there was one last thing I wanted to bring up, and then I think it's time we ended this session. But Jayati, I'm curious about your view on India, how they sort of fit into this story, where you're also one of the few people I've heard that is quite negative about India's economy, or let's say more negative than most of the economists I've heard, because they often cite like the typical numbers, right? Like real GDP growth is high, and I don't know what else they're citing, but they seem to be really excited. Stock market is the other one they frequently cite, right? But given what Howard just said, where China has been really successful in creating this competitive environment, what happened with India? Like, where has it gone wrong, or has it gone wrong? Was I misinterpreting what you said?
You interpreted it completely correctly. And I have to say, listening to Howard, now I was also getting further depressed, like Bram, you were getting depressed earlier, because, oh my God, we could have done all of these things in India, and it is so tragic how much we have missed the boat. It is absolutely, utterly depressing how much, India has really missed the boat, and how we really, and not necessarily just because, the Modi government, but overall, in the last 2 decades, there is so much more we could have done. First, under the previous government, there was this obsession with services rather than manufacturing as the key towards the new economy, as if you can really do it that way, as if you can simply forget about the significance of manufacturing in an economy like India. And then this ignoring of employment generation as absolutely critical. So yes, am I more negative about the Indian economy? Absolutely. But for me, I'm very unhappy about being so negative, because we have so much potential, right? I mean, 10 years ago, everybody was talking about this demographic dividend that India is going to have. And right now, it is actually a demographic disaster. It's not even a time bomb waiting to explode. It's exploded. We have tens of millions of young people coming into the job market every year, and there are no jobs. And these are young men and women who have gone through tertiary education. And most of our tertiary education is now privatized. About 90% of it, believe it or not, is private, which really means that they have paid a lot of money, that parents have sold their land and their assets. They have gone into debt to put these children through higher education, and they come out of it and there are no jobs. You advertise a job for a signaller on the railways, something that needs a class 5 qualification. And you will get everything from people who have done engineering degrees to people who have done PhDs applying for it, because it is a regular job paying at least the government's minimum wage, which you will not get in any private sector occupation anymore, except for the extremely lucky skilled ones. So yes, there's a farmers, as you know, have been protesting now for years. There's a real unrest because farming is not viable. Imagine, in a country like India, agriculture is not viable now. Farmers have to do other stuff to keep going, to keep even being able to farm. And of course, we have a government in complete denial. And so I also realize it's that they simply don't want to address the problem. They want to just pretend that it's not there, which means, number one, either preventing data from coming out. We haven't had a census. The last census was 2011. So we can not even counting how many people we have and where they are and what they do. We haven't had a proper consumption survey. They scrapped the one that showed that consumption had fallen in 2017-18. They scrapped that. And they were supposed to have it the next year. They haven't. They finally brought out something just before the election, but it wasn't a report. It was a fact sheet that suddenly shows consumption increasing dramatically because they've changed the methodology. And according to that one, suddenly we're down to 5% poverty. Okay. They have then, the multidimensional poverty index showed us in a bad light. So they decided they didn't like that data. They produced their own multidimensional poverty index. And of course, no surprises there. We barely have any multidimensional poverty, according to that index. They didn't like the World Hunger Index, the children's malnutrition index. They didn't like any of these global indices. So they're just producing their own data, God knows from where, because they're not doing any of the surveys that are required.
This actually makes a lot of sense, because anytime I've tried to do a bit of analysis of India, I just didn't get that far, because I thought it was just me, but it just seemed like there wasn't that much data available.
There isn't. No, they basically are denying us access. We had one of the best statistical systems in the developing world. And now we don't have one. It's been completely hollowed out and undermined and destroyed. It's tragic in so many different ways. But if you have a government that doesn't want others to know and therefore is willing not to know itself, that means it's not interested in governing. It's just interested in the PR exercise.
But now here's the kicker, is apparently that has worked, because in Sri Lanka, most people believe that they should follow the Indian path rather than the Vietnamese path.
Yes,
And
again, yeah.
And exactly what you were saying, right? Again, we're down that services line where it's like, yeah, no, we can, I don't know the terms they use, frog leap or something, just bypass leapfrog, sorry, yeah.
Yes.
The whole manufacturing thing, go straight for the services. And, first of all, as if that hasn't been tried before in India and Sri Lanka. And second, where's any theory to back all of this? We've been through this so many times. And also, even with the data that we have, you want to go down India's path rather than Vietnam's path? I mean...
Yeah, it would be unbelievable if there weren't power relations involved. And so, the reason why the Modi government has been so successful in peddling this story, which is completely false, right? But it's been successful because it suits global interests. The West really wants to hear that story. And India is in this geopolitical sweet spot, right? Everybody wants to quote India. Whether it's Russia or the US or everybody. And of course, global capital wants to perpetuate the story of the Indian success, because the beneficiaries are global capital and the Indian elite. I mean, I don't believe our growth numbers. I don't think they are 7% or whatever. But even if they say 5%, if all of that growth is going to the top 10% of the population, imagine their income growth shooting through the roof, right? You walk into a mall in Delhi, you will not believe you're in India. You could be in Paris or you could be anywhere in the world. People are swizzling champagne. They are buying Rolex watches. They're living a lifestyle that was unimaginable even a decade ago.
I mean, we really don't need to look much further beyond, what was it? I always confuse the family names. The Adani wedding, was it?
Ambani wedding.
Yeah.
Adani is the one who is Modi's closest crony and is the one who's now in the crosshairs of pretty much every international.
Right. But they were the ones that had that massive wedding.
No, the Ambanis had the wedding.
That was
the other one. Right. The other ones had the wedding. Yes.
I mean, something like that just seems so ridiculous to me, given how most of Indians still live. Yes. I mean, that contrast alone should tell people that there's something not completely right, isn't it, in an economy?
It's utterly depressing. The degree of inequality is beyond anything I have seen anywhere in the world. And, I mean, seriously, I've been in South Africa just after the apartheid regime was lifted, which was extreme inequality, and at that time registered as the most unequal economy. But I swear to you, India is worse. Because so many of the absolutely poor, and I'm sure Howard knows this, they don't even get counted in that. I mean, it's absolutely obscene inequality. And somehow they are able to divert the population through, messages of hatred, finally, and various divisive kinds of political activity. And by massaging data so that people who are not doing well, which is most of the population, think, oh, well, it's my bad luck. I'm not doing well. But obviously the economy is doing really well, right?
Well, we can end this session on a positive note that the US has joined India in that respect, where quite a lot of data is being massaged. What Howard and I frequently bring up, I don't know if you've ever seen this, Jayati, is there's this economist called John Williams who started
the Washington Consensus. No, that's William's son.
This is another guy. He started producing an alternative
shadow government.
Yeah, his website is Shadow Government Statistics.
I see.
But it's actually, it's not that fancy what he does, because what he's simply doing is he's saying, right, in 1994, something changed about the way that we calculate unemployment. I'm just going to continue how we used to count employment. He did that. Currently, so the official unemployment rate is what, 4% in the US?
Yes.
Something like that?
Yeah.
If you were to count it the way he does it and the way the US used to do it before 1994, it's actually closer to 17%. 17, yeah. And so this was, and actually Forbes has quite a few articles about this, how they actually changed the whole counting of the unemployment statistics, because basically it involves saying that people that after I think 10 or 9 months of looking for a job, if they haven't found a job by that time, they clearly don't want to be employed. And so we don't need to count them anymore.
So they're not in the labor force.
Exactly. And so that was one of the ways. And there were a few others, like if you mow your neighbor's lawn like once a week, then technically that's also a part-time job as much as working, let's say 30 hours a week would be. And, it doesn't matter what quality the job is or what your income is on that. And so all this massaging has led to a fantastic unemployment figure, which, mind you, Trump was criticizing before he came in 2016. He actually said the unemployment statistics are complete bullshit. And to me, that explains why he was so popular and is so popular, right? If these are the true unemployment numbers, it actually makes far more sense with also the homelessness that we're seeing in California and in Seattle and and
in New York. I was in New York this week. It's actually quite shocking. Yes.
I mean, does a 4% unemployment rate make sense in that context?
Yeah.
But as soon as he came into power, Trump, he of course immediately switched to the official statistics and says, "Look how good I'm doing," and we're there. Where the similarities are there.
Wow, this is fascinating. I didn't know this about the US. Yeah,
the weakness is there, and they're massaging the numbers, and at the same time, also there's more and more of this tendency, right, to find someone to blame. So this is Trump's popularity in a nutshell, I think, is, we found immigrants and China to blame all the problems on. And I think, the problems are real. But the way that he's going about it, I'm not sure he's going to be able to turn the ship around.
Yes, we'll have to see. It's definitely interesting times, which was a Chinese curse, of course, but still, we have to go through them. I'm afraid I have to leave, but this has been a really interesting conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed this.
Me too. And Howard, I hope you too.
Thanks, Jayati.